as well. So I'd like to talk as well a little bit about the visual side of things. So we've talked about language and how to structure our language and use storytelling in our language. Let's look at how we use that when it comes to visuals, including data. Okay. I think unless you're filling out a template that has no space and clearly does not want you to integrate visuals or a visual presentation of data, I think you should really think about how you can integrate visuals into your reports. Okay. We know that this is important. Hands up right now if you've read any of the words on this screen, or have you just looked at the visual down here at this point? Okay, so we know where our eyes are drawn, all right, when we're looking at information. We look at colors, we look at visuals first. And that's often what sticks out and that's often what we remember the most. Okay, so the more that we can use visuals, not just as a graphic design element to make things look pretty, but to think about how do we use those visuals to tell our story, to advance the story that we're telling in our reporting. Okay, so we don't just pick a random photo because the child in that photo happens to be particularly cute and is going to make people smile. No, we want to pick visuals that are connecting to the story that we're telling and that are going to help our audiences, our stakeholders understand that impact story, connect with that impact story, and help lead people to where we want them to be in terms of what they think, what they feel, what actions they're going to take. Okay. But visuals are important. They turn people into witnesses of the project, just like the descriptive words that I mentioned, so it could help people like me to be able to imagine what it's like in the place where you're implementing your project. Visuals and images can help do that. They help create an emotional response. They illustrate your conclusions, your story, and they draw your eye to the most important information. So some examples of the kinds of visuals that you can use in your reports. Obviously, photographs. This is the one I think that we use, a lot. We rely on a lot. Suggest that when you're thinking about which photographs to use, think about how the photographs advance your story in terms of illustrating your impact from a before and after perspective. Okay. How they humanize and create an emotional response to the impact you're describing. So if you're talking about training farmers, a cute photograph of a little child is probably not the appropriate image to choose because it has nothing to do with the story you're telling about farmers. It can be used to draw the eye to something you really want stakeholders to read as a key takeaway. Okay. So some considerations for the use of photographs. If you are planning to use photography or those kinds of images in your reporting, you have to plan ahead, okay? Because you just taking a photograph after the fact of something isn't really going to be helpful. It certainly doesn't show the impact because there's no context of the before. So you can't see the change if you only have one photograph, okay? If you are going to use a photograph, say, of an activity being implemented, taking a photograph after the training while everyone's standing together in a row is not going to be as engaging as taking a photograph while people are engaged and look like they're participating in the activity itself. Thinking about the quality of your images, the clarity, resolution, whether they are a picture that people are going to want to look at, size, positioning in your report so that it's helping to support your report, your story, as opposed to distracting from it. Mark mentioned earlier when you're talking about photographs about participants and stakeholders, making sure you have consent to share that image is of course important as well. Yes, Mark.
So not sure if this is the right place, but something visual in a report is the way it looks, the layout of the report.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a whole page of just writing, even if you throw in a picture, it's very hard to read.
Yeah.
So to look at the fonts, the layouts, the coloring, all those things are part of a visual experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Here's a photograph of some participants in a project that CAP Network is partnered with. What do you think of this photo? Are you curious as to who these people are? Does it engage you in any way?
I need a caption. I need a caption.
Yeah. Because on its own, this image doesn't really tell a story, right?
If anything, a conflicting story, actually, if anything, because you see people that are kind of looking, to me, would appear boxed in a corner, would should elicit fear or something, and they have smiles on their faces. So, if anything, it's confusing.
Okay, so obviously I'm showing you these images without context, right? Without names or place or what they have, but what do you think about this image in relation to having a before image as well? So if this image here is the after, and here's the before, does that make a difference to how you experience that image?
Yes.
Now, unfortunately, by the time the project comes to reporting, hopefully the family looks like this, right? But if you haven't thought in advance about how you might use images to be part of your illustrating impact, you may not have remembered to take the before photo as well. Okay, so just planning ahead and thinking about how you might want to visually document the work that you're doing so that you have the opportunity to use imagery to support your impact story. Short, I see a question here about short videos. Yeah, absolutely. Short videos are amazing. I think videos go even further than images when you can use them to just help transport your audience to a place and time and feel like they're really witnessing what's happening and hearing directly from people. That can be very humanizing and helpful as well. Okay, so charts and graphs. This is for Dave. Dave Lane earlier was like, what about the data? Numbers can speak too. And yes, they can. And I think numbers and data, illustrating data, can be really effective if you're using the data to advance the story you're telling. Okay, so I think we need to think about how we present data from a storytelling perspective as well. So what is the point? If you're going to share a graph, why are you sharing that particular graph? What is it you want the person looking at that graph to take away? What conclusion have you drawn from that data that you want them to also draw from that data? Okay. They are very helpful for presenting lots of data or interrelated data in a easy, short way that might take pages and pages of explanation. But if you can get a visual done well, you can contain a lot of information in a short amount of space. Okay, but really, I would suggest that other than using presenting data sort of as a data table or a data set like in an annex, anything that you're including in a report or in a story or in an article should be very carefully selected for its ability to advance the point you're trying to make, to advance the story that you're telling, okay? So some considerations are in how you present it, limiting colors, thinking about the colors that you use, making sure that it's easy to understand. So the conclusion is going to jump off the page to your audience, as opposed to them staring at it for 10 minutes trying to figure out what it all means. Okay, making sure that you use text to explain what people should be looking at in that data set so they understand why they're even seeing it. Okay, and then really to think about, this is the piece that I would think about whether it advances your storyline to integrate it into the story piece, or whether it's really a fiduciary, we're reporting on our data set, and then in which case it can be in an appendix or an annex, or maybe it's both, depending on the audience. Just in terms of how data can look, okay? This is This is a data set that I created. This is a Microsoft template produced pie chart, okay? This data set is about whether the training we talked about in the storytelling piece about agroforestry was helpful to their farming, okay? And if you're the donor who's paid for this training because you want to improve farming practices, you're interested, right, in whether the farmers responded well to that training. What do you think of this presentation of data? Is it easy to understand? How about now?
I think the first one was much easier to interpret. This one.
You like this one better? Okay. What do you like about it?
It's first of all, it's eye-catching, and it clearly shows the percentages at each level, like strongly agree, disagree, or strongly agree, disagree. Then strongly agree is repeated. Maybe that was a mistake.
Oh, sorry, that should be strongly disagree. You're right.
Yeah, strongly disagree, I think, the 5%.
So what is the story that you take from this?
The story I take from this is that the training level of agreement about whether the agro training was helpful. So the story I take from this is that 55% of the trainees strongly agreed with the training being helpful to them. So in conclusion, the training was quite helpful to the farmers. Now this one, the pie chart is not quite catching, and then there are two colors to represent the same thing. So it gets confusing. And then disagree and strongly disagree is also in the same pie chart unit. So how do I differentiate?
Right. So in this case, well, I think the point that I'm trying to make here is it depends on what the story is you're trying to tell. So if I'm writing a story that says, good news, the training was really well received in the community, the participants en masse agreed that it was helpful for their farming, whatever, I might include a little visual like this. Maybe you can include the percentages here if you think that that data is relevant. But really what I'm trying to show is that you can use the words, you can use the way you design the chart to tell the story you're trying to tell, because this is what I want the reader to know. 85% said it was great. Awesome. Okay. Now, depending on, as you said, Naomi, so depending on your audience, maybe they want to know the breakdown of all of that data. The question what I would suggest is in your story, like integrated into your report, might not be the place to have all of that data about who agreed, who strongly disagreed, what age group, gender. You might not need all of that to make the point you're trying to make. I'll just jump ahead a couple of slides. I might include something like this as an annex, okay, that shows how, you know, things change and break down the data. If you're reporting to a funder or to a stakeholder that wants to see the data, you can include all of the data in an annex. But presenting complex data can be confusing and distract people from the story you're trying to tell in the context of your narrative, right? Where you're writing your story. But you may, if you're Naomi, want to add percentages here, which is fine too. Okay, this is very streamlined. There's a whole spectrum between this, right? And this, and you got to figure out what's going to be most appropriate. But think about how you can redesign charts so that they are easy to, they are simple to understand. They support the point that you're making. Okay, Mark?
Go back to that.
This one?
Yeah.
Or first one? This one?
This one,
okay.
This one. So I understand what you're saying. It is often the case in polls that they amalgamate categories to say, yeah, 80% or 85% agreed, and then you break it down. But in something like this, what I've done, and it's difficult to do, is to include an actual picture here. You might have a picture of some farmers in the bottom hand corner that pulls you in, like what you said before, picture pulls you in.
Mhm.
And so now you're relating, oh, here's a farmer and here's the data about them. And that could make it even more powerful.
Absolutely. And it's also a place like with the quotation that we had in the previous slide from Agatha about how she appreciated the training. If you could put all of those elements together, man, the conclusion is going to jump right off the page, right? For your audience. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not going to be for every kind of report,
No.
because if you
No,
do
it's not.
an annual report, or even a media report, having the whole thing together, the pictures are worth 10,000 words. But
Mhm.
if you're doing it to your funder, they're going to want to see the details that I saw you had later on.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Maybe to add on to, I'll just re-echo Mark's voice. The layout of the report that you have will also determine the degree to which you expose certain information, or if you need all the statistics or not.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I think for the more, I think generally speaking, the more formal your reporting relationship. So, and this often means the more money a donor is giving you, the more level of detail they're probably going to want to look at. And the more time they're going to spend looking at that level of detail of data too, right? So thinking about what's going to resonate with the different audiences. This is just another example of Microsoft built-in template created graph, okay? And this is showing CAP scores. CAP scores are a way of tracking how people, a capacity or change that people experience after training. So it looks at knowledge, attitudes, and practice, okay? So this is a graph that's showing the improvement of CAP scores from baseline, midline to end line of a project, broken down, disaggregated by gender and age. Okay.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
So is CAP an acronym, or is it a type of score?
It's an acronym for knowledge, attitudes, and practice, but a CAP survey, they usually just use the acronym CAP. It's a way of capturing data and surveying people to see how their thinking and behavior changes over time.
Okay, so in your report, would you have a glossary of acronyms?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay. So here I'm so looking at this chart. What is it that you're supposed to understand from this? Okay. What's the story that's being told here? What stands out for you?
The first story that comes to at the first sight, it looks like there was improvement in knowledge, attitude, and perception of both men and female, right from the baseline compared to the end of the project. When I look at the baseline against the end line, it's shooting. So there's
Everything's
improvement.
going up. That's good, right? That's a good news story.
That's the first one.
Women over 40 were not doing as well.
Mm-hmm. So here's the same data presented also in a line graph. Okay. Okay. It's a little bit more streamlined. Okay. It shows the same trends. Few things that I've done here that I want you to notice is zooming in shows a little bit more detail about these curves. So everything was going up, but it wasn't going up smoothly, right? So sometimes when you zoom in and you can change the axis to zoom in on the data, you actually can see the data better and understand it more, the story, okay? So this again simplifies it, draws your eye to the outlier, because this is really the part of the story that you might be focusing on in a report is, why was this line so much different from all of the other lines that kind of ended up at the same place, okay? Why was their experience different? So you'd want to explain that or draw the reader's eye to that, because that's what you're trying to talk about as your story. Okay. So it's just a thinking about how you present. So it is great to include data to back it up. It gives the evidence for the story that you're telling, the impact you're saying has taken place. But think critically, take the time to think through how you want to present that data so that the data aligns with your story and help support the story you want your reader, your audience to be focused on. Okay. Now, obviously, this is completely made up. This is just an example. It's not from a real project, but just showing sort of how you can tell the story. And this is also an example of being honest about an outlier or a challenge you experienced, right? And you could look at this and think, oh my goodness, these women were not doing so well. But explaining what you did and how you've addressed that challenge turns that challenge story, or what could be seen as a failure, into actually a success story of progress, right? And learning. Okay. So I think we're going to do a whole session next year. We've got a lot of requests to talk about Excel and how to use Excel for data analysis and that. So we can do a lot more and delve into this. And Naomi, I hope you will join in and we can debate how much level of detail is the right level of detail, and really sort of delve into how we can present data effectively. I've already flipped to this slide to show you, but there are ways of doing both. So you may in your report have very streamlined, I'm only using this to make one particular point kind of presentation, and then you can include your detailed data sets in an annex or an appendix. I would also draw your eye to as well. There are things that you can do visually that can help your reader to understand data sets as well, so that they don't have to figure it all out for themselves, right? And even using simple things like these are called spark lines in Excel to show the trend really sort of helps you to be able to understand the data at a quicker glance, as opposed to really having to think through and looking at each individual number and trying to figure out what it all means, okay? And you can see, again, the use of language. So instead of just having a chart title, using words to explain the data so that people know what they're looking for, and they're going to draw the conclusion that you've drawn and understand how you've understood that data and the story. Right. Anything else on data presentation that's pressing for today? Okay. Then let's look at some other examples of how we can use visuals, samples, diagrams, maps. Okay, these are also helpful for providing sort of that behind the scenes access to the project work itself, or some of the more technical work that you might be doing as part of your projects. They can also be helpful for before and afters to understand the change and impact, but also for illustrating context, okay? Some considerations are, licensed use. So if you're using a map, for example, to help people understand what the setting, the community looks like, the neighborhood, the village where the project has taken place, where is the school, where is the water well, where's the clinic, these sorts of things to help understand context are great, but they make sure you have permission to use them if they've been designed by someone outside of your organization. And then really think about, because diagrams and maps and stuff tend to have a lot going on, or a lot of words or labels or that, think about how much is it contributing to the story, because there is also the risk that they can become visual noise, okay? So people might look at them at the expense of the story. So again, just like photographs, just like data, think about how you're using them effectively, choosing the right visuals, choosing the placement and the size and the colors, so that they're really advancing your story as opposed to distracting from it, okay? here's something, this is a, if you're talking about a project where children are going to school, something like this that reminds the reader of, oh yes, these are children, right? And they draw pictures and have dreams just like my children do, can be maybe helpful, help engage and draw someone in. I see a lot of smiles potentially from people who are mothers who have children who are thinking about how that reminds them of a picture their own child drew many years ago. Here's another example. These are 3 different diagrams of the exact same thing. I would say very different in terms of how they're going to draw your eye or their potential utility or appropriateness to different stakeholders. So you may have decided that you want to include a diagram of a ventilated pit latrine because your stakeholder audience has probably never seen one for themselves. But thinking about which kind of diagram, from either just very black and white and technical, something a little bit more that shows how it works, and something that's really going to make people go, oh, I wasn't expecting to see someone pooping in this report. But thinking about your audience, okay, which is going to be most appropriate and how is it going to help them to understand and also connect with the story. The last thing, and this is Mark, you mentioned this a few slides ago, the importance of thinking about visuals in terms of layout, white space, colors, consistency of your visual to help make your content easy to read, easy to understand, easy to follow, so that the key information is popping out of the screen for people. Which information is in bold, which information is in a call out box, okay? So these are helpful, these kinds of design elements or iconography or layout, color schemes help with visual flow. They help guide the reader's eye. You may be using icons to help separate content out. It can be used for timelines, explaining processes. Okay, these can be very helpful. Some considerations, again, I urge you to think about limited color scheme so that it's not distracting to the eye, but rather helping to guide the eye. Being consistent. If you're, depending on your organization, you may have brand guidelines that you need to think about. There might be colors that you always use that help remind your stakeholders of who you are and connect to your brand or your logo or your name. Okay, making sure you're using things that look professional. Thinking about your fonts, for example, there are some fonts that are really fun, but maybe not appropriate in a formal report. There may be fonts that are fun and scripty that are perfectly appropriate for a report to an individual donor or a partner in the community or to your beneficiaries. Here's an example of a design piece of using icons to illustrate a timeline. This could probably save, an entire paragraph around your work plan and what you're doing when, and probably stand out a little bit clearer for someone. I really like, in this case, the red line that shows, and this is where we are now. This is the piece I want to be talking about. Just so you know, Katie is really, really good at these things. So if you have something around your project, a process or a timeline or you want to do a graphic visual that shows how different elements of your work connect to create impact, that's probably something Katie would be happy. I'm just volunteering Katie, would be happy to help you with and sort of work through how to do that. She did this one for the Rainmaker project she's involved with.